power, arrogance, the sharp crack of a wooden gavel. Judge Alfred Pendleton believed his courtroom was an untouchable kingdom where his quiet prejudices could dictate the law. But today, the young man he was so eager to destroy held a secret that would shatter the judge's life in an instant. The air inside Division 302B of the State Superior Court was stale, thick with the weight of shattered lives and impending doom. High above the polished oak tables and the nervous murmurs of the gallery sat the Honorable Judge Alfred Pendleton. To the local press, he was known as a tough-on-crime jurist, a man who didn't coddle criminals. But to the defense attorneys who had the misfortune of standing before him, Pendleton was something far more dangerous. A man whose deeply ingrained prejudices masqueraded as legal precedent. He was 62, with silver hair meticulously combed back and eyes that held the cold, calculating detachment of a predator. Pendleton had spent 2 decades on the bench, and in that time, a clear pattern had emerged. If you were wealthy and white, you received leniency, a stern talking to, and a slap on the wrist. If you were a minority from the eastern district of the city, Pendleton threw the book at you, making sure the binding hit you squarely in the jaw. Seated at the defense table was 22-year-old David Caldwell. David was a mechanical engineering student at the State University, a young black man who worked 2 night shifts at a local logistics warehouse to keep his student loans from drowning him. He was wearing a borrowed, ill-fitting gray suit. His hands were clasped so tightly on the table that his knuckles were bone white. David was terrified, and he had every right to be. David was charged with the aggravated assault and armed robbery of Richard Sullivan, a prominent local real estate developer. Sullivan had been mugged in a dimly lit parking garage downtown. His Rolex, wallet, and briefcase were stolen. Sullivan had told the police that his attacker was a tall, young black man in a dark hoodie. That was it. That was the entirety of the description. 2 days later, David, who matched that painfully vague description and happened to be walking home from his warehouse job near the vicinity, was stopped by Detective Gregory Higgins. Despite having no stolen property on his person, no criminal record, and a solid alibi from his shift manager, David was arrested. The police conducted a wildly suggestive photo lineup, and Sullivan, eager to find a culprit, pointed at David's picture. "All rise," Bailiff Thomas boomed, his voice echoing off the high ceiling as Judge Pendleton swept into the room, his black robes billowing like a storm cloud. Pendleton took his seat, barely glancing at the courtroom. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the docket. When his eyes finally landed on the defense table, a subtle, patronizing sneer twitched at the corner of his mouth. "Case number 44-092, State versus Caldwell," Pendleton announced, his voice a dry rasp. "Are the parties ready to proceed?" "The State is ready, Your Honor," Prosecutor William Hayes said smoothly. Hayes was a sharp, ambitious lawyer who knew exactly how to play to Pendleton's biases. "The defense is ready, Your Honor," said Claire Montgomery. Claire was a seasoned public defender, sharp as a tack, and notoriously resilient. She knew Pendleton's reputation well. She had spent the last 3 nights building an ironclad defense for David, gathering GPS data from David's phone and a sworn affidavit from his warehouse manager, proving David was miles away when Sullivan was attacked. "Very well," Pendleton said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Before we bring the jury in, Miss Montgomery, I have reviewed your pre-trial motions regarding the admissibility of the defendant's smartphone geolocation data." "Yes, Your Honor," Claire said, standing up confidently. "The data clearly shows my client's device was at the sorting facility on the industrial side of town during the exact window the robbery took place. It is the cornerstone of our alibi." Pendleton sighed, a long, exaggerated sound of annoyance. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose as if dealing with a petulant child. "Miss Montgomery, the State has raised valid concerns regarding the chain of custody of this data. Furthermore, I find the forensic expert you intend to call to verify this data lacks the necessary credentials to satisfy the court." Claire's jaw dropped. "Your Honor, Dr. Harrison is a leading digital forensics expert, who has testified in federal court over 40 times. The state's objection is baseless. Striking this evidence effectively strips my client of his constitutional right to present a defense. Pendleton slammed his hand flat on the desk, the sound mimicking a gunshot. You will not raise your voice in my courtroom, counselor. I have made my ruling. Given the demographics of the defendant's neighborhood and the known gang affiliations present there, it is highly probable the device was handed off to an accomplice to manufacture an alibi. The evidence is circumstantial and highly prejudicial. It is excluded. David turned to Claire, panic flooding his eyes. He can't do that, can he? That's proof I wasn't there. Claire placed a reassuring hand on his arm, though her own heart was pounding with fury. Pendleton was legally wrapping his racism in the guise of judicial discretion. He was making assumptions about David based entirely on his race and zip code, using gang affiliations as a dog whistle to justify suppressing exculpatory evidence. Your Honor, for the record, the defense vehemently objects, Claire stated, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. There is absolutely zero evidence of gang affiliation in this case. None. Pendleton offered a cold, condescending smile. Your objection is noted for the record, Miss Montgomery. Let's not pretend we don't know how these things work. Young men from that side of the tracks have a certain culture of covering for each other. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus to accommodate it. Bring in the jury. As the bailiff went to retrieve the jurors, Pendleton leaned over his microphone, ensuring it was turned off, and looked directly at David. You might have fooled your public defender, son, but you don't fool me. I know exactly what kind of person you are. David swallowed hard, the injustice of the room pressing down on his chest like physical weight. But what Judge Pendleton didn't know, what no one in the room knew except David, was that David wasn't just a random engineering student, and the man he had been quietly texting before the trial started was about to turn Judge Pendleton's kingdom into a graveyard. The jury, a carefully selected group that leaned heavily older and affluent, filed into the box. Prosecutor Hayes wasted no time painting a terrifying picture. During his opening statement, he described Richard Sullivan not just as a victim, but as a pillar of the community who was preyed upon by the criminal element lurking in the shadows of their fair city. He repeatedly pointed at David, using words like thug, predator, and opportunist. Every time Hayes used one of these racially coded buzzwords, Claire objected. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is using inflammatory language designed to prejudice the jury. Overruled, Pendleton would drawl lazily. The state is merely characterizing the severity of the crime, Miss Montgomery. Please refrain from interrupting the flow of the opening statements unless you have a valid legal basis. When it was Claire's turn, she walked to the podium, making direct eye contact with the jurors. Ladies and gentlemen, David Caldwell is 22 years old. He works 40 hours a week at a warehouse and takes 15 credit hours at the state university. He has no criminal record. He was arrested simply because he is a young black man who happened to be walking in the wrong place at the wrong time, matching a description so vague it could fit thousands of men in this city. The state's entire case rests on a flawed eyewitness identification made in a state of trauma. Objection, Hayes shouted. Counsel is testifying. Sustained, Pendleton snapped immediately. Miss Montgomery, confine your opening to what the evidence will show, not your personal social commentary. The trial proceeded like a slow, agonizing execution. The state called Richard Sullivan to the stand. Sullivan, looking pristine in a custom-tailored Navy suit, confidently pointed at David. That's him. I'd never forget the eyes of the man who put a knife to my throat. Claire approached the podium for cross-examination. She knew eyewitness testimony, especially cross-racial identification, was notoriously unreliable. Mr. Sullivan, you testified the attack happened in the underground parking structure of the Sentinel building, correct? Yes, Sullivan said haughtily, and the lighting down there is quite poor. In fact, a police report from 2 weeks prior to your attack noted that 4 of the overhead fluorescent bulbs in that specific sector were burned out. It was dark, but I saw what I saw, Sullivan insisted. The attacker was wearing a dark hoodie, pulled up over his head. You testified The entire interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. Isn't it true, Mr. Sullivan, that when the police first asked you for a description, you couldn't even specify the color of the attacker's eyes or whether he had facial hair? Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. I was in shock. Understandably, Claire nodded. But 3 days later, when Detective Higgins showed you a photo array, you picked my client. Did Detective Higgins happen to mention to you that my client was the only person in that photo array who was actually arrested near the scene? Objection! Hayes leaped to his feet, assumes facts not in evidence and attempts to introduce hearsay. Sustained, Pendleton said sharply. The jury will disregard that question. Miss Montgomery, you are treading on very thin ice. Claire pressed on, fighting through a barrage of sustained objections. Pendleton was systematically shutting down every avenue she had to dismantle the state's flimsy narrative. He was building a wall around the prosecution's case, ensuring the jury only saw exactly what he wanted them to see, a guilty verdict. During the afternoon recess, Claire pulled David into a small, windowless holding room adjacent to the court. She paced the floor, her hands running through her hair in frustration. He's railroading us, Claire muttered, her voice trembling with anger. Pendleton is literally acting as a second prosecutor. Without the phone data, and with him blocking my cross-examination on the photo array, we are fighting with both hands tied behind our backs. David sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. The sheer terror that had gripped him earlier that morning had begun to morph into something else. It was a cold, quiet anger. Miss Montgomery, David said softly. What happens if a judge is found to have a severe conflict of interest in a case, like a financial one? Claire stopped pacing and looked at him, her brow furrowed. What do you mean? If a judge has a conflict of interest, he is legally obligated to recuse himself. If he doesn't, and it's discovered, it's grounds for an immediate mistrial, a review by the Judicial Ethics Board, and potentially disbarment or criminal charges depending on the severity. Why do you ask? David reached into the breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I didn't want to bring this up because I didn't want to believe the system was this corrupt. I thought the truth would just come out normally, but my uncle told me to hold on to this, just in case. Claire took the paper. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the dense text. It was a printout of a corporate shell company filing, heavily encrypted, but deciphered enough to show the principal officers. The company was named Apex Holdings, LLC. I don't understand, Claire said. What is this? Look at the board of directors, David said, pointing to a highlighted line. Claire read the names aloud. Richard Sullivan, Alfred Pendleton. She gasped, the air completely leaving her lungs. The judge and the victim. They are business partners? Not just business partners, David corrected quietly. Apex Holdings owns the Sentinel building, the very building where the robbery supposedly happened. My uncle is a forensic accountant. He's been investigating Sullivan for a class-action lawsuit regarding housing discrimination. He found Pendleton's name buried in the LLC's offshore tax documents. Claire's hands began to shake. The implications were staggering. Judge Pendleton wasn't just biased against David's race. He was actively presiding over a criminal trial involving his own secret business partner and a property he partially owned. It was a violation of judicial ethics so profound it defied belief. Pendleton was ensuring a conviction to protect Sullivan's credibility, perhaps because a deeper investigation into Sullivan's affairs would expose their illegal financial ties. David, Claire whispered, her eyes wide. Why didn't you give me this immediately? Because, David said, a hardened edge to his voice, if we brought it up before the trial, Pendleton would have just quietly recused himself and passed the case to another judge to keep it buried. My uncle told me to wait. He said to let Pendleton cross the line on the record. Let him violate my rights in front of the court reporter. Trap him. Claire stared at the young engineering student, realizing she had vastly underestimated him. This wasn't just a defense anymore. This was an ambush. Okay, Claire said, a fierce, predatory smile spreading across her face. The gavel had been struck against them all day. It was time to swing the hammer back. When court resumes, we are going to burn his kingdom to the ground. All rise, Bailiff Thomas droned, his voice lacking the booming authority it held that morning. The afternoon session of the State Superior Court was back in session. Judge Alfred Pendleton swept into the room, his black robes masking the corruption that rotted beneath. He settled into his high-backed leather chair, a portrait of unbothered superiority. He looked out over his domain, his eyes briefly flicking to the gallery, then to the prosecution table, and finally, with a heavy dose of disdain, to the defense. "Miss Montgomery," Pendleton said, his tone dripping with mock patience. "Does the defense have any witnesses to call? Or are we ready to move to closing arguments and spare this jury any more wasted time?" Claire Montgomery stood. She smoothed the front of her blazer, her posture impossibly straight. The nervous energy that had consumed her in the holding cell was completely gone, replaced by the icy, calculated calm of an apex predator circling its prey. "The defense has no new witnesses, Your Honor," Claire said, her voice ringing out clearly across the silent courtroom. "However, we request permission to recall the state's primary witness, Richard Sullivan, to the stand for further cross-examination. New information has come to light regarding the location of the alleged crime." Prosecutor William Hayes shot up from his chair. "Objection! Your Honor, the state has rested its case. The defense had ample opportunity to cross-examine Mr. Sullivan this morning. This is a desperate stalling tactic." Pendleton leaned forward, his silver eyebrows knitting together in a scowl. "I am inclined to agree with the state, Counselor. You had your bite at the apple. What possible new information could justify dragging the victim back to the stand?" "Information that directly impacts the credibility of the witness and his motive to fabricate the details of the attack, Your Honor," Claire replied, without missing a beat. "It pertains to the specific layout, security measures, and ownership of the Sentinel Building's parking garage, where the incident allegedly occurred." Pendleton let out a long, patronizing sigh. He glanced at the jury box. He knew that denying the defense the right to recall a witness over a seemingly valid claim of newly discovered evidence might give them grounds for an appeal that would take the case out of his controlled jurisdiction. He wanted this conviction airtight, handled quietly and swiftly in his own house. "Very well," Pendleton grumbled, waving a dismissive hand. "But I am warning you, Miss Montgomery. You are on a very short leash. If this turns into another one of your fishing expeditions regarding gang culture or societal woes, I will hold you in contempt. Bailiff, bring Mr. Sullivan back to the stand." Richard Sullivan strutted back into the courtroom, looking deeply inconvenienced. He took his seat in the witness box, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and glared at David. David met his gaze, no longer trembling, his expression an unreadable mask of stoic resolve. "Mr. Sullivan," Claire began, stepping out from behind the podium and walking slowly toward the jury box. "This morning you testified that you were attacked in the lower sublevel of the Sentinel Building's parking garage. Is that correct?" "Yes," Sullivan said, crossing his arms. "I already answered that. You also testified that it was very dark due to several broken light fixtures. Tell me, Mr. Sullivan, as a prominent real estate developer who works in high-end commercial properties, didn't you find it odd that a luxury office building had such abysmal security? No functioning cameras in that sub-level, broken lights. It seems like a dangerous place to park." "I don't manage the building's maintenance," Sullivan scoffed. "I just park there when I have meetings downtown. I am a victim of a violent crime. The lighting has nothing to do with the fact that your client put a knife to my throat." "Objection," Hayes called out lazily from his seat. "Argumentative. Relevance." "Sustained," Pendleton barked. "Miss Montgomery, get to the point." "The point, Your Honor, is establishing why Mr. Sullivan was in that specific unmonitored sublevel in the first place," Claire pivoted smoothly. She walked back to her table and picked up a single, standard manila folder. "Mr. Sullivan, you claim you have no control over the building's maintenance, but you do have control over its management, don't you?" Sullivan's arrogant sneer faltered for a fraction of a second. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Let me be specific," Claire said, her voice rising in volume. Isn't it true that you are a principal officer of Apex Holdings, LLC, the shell corporation that purchased the Sentinel building 3 years ago? Hayes jumped up, genuinely confused. Objection, Your Honor. What does the ownership of the building have to do with an armed robbery? Pendleton's face remained frozen, but his knuckles gripped the edge of his mahogany desk tightly enough to turn his skin white. He leaned toward his microphone. Sustained. Miss Montgomery, this is exactly the kind of irrelevant tangent I warned you about. The corporate structure of the building's ownership has absolutely no bearing on this criminal proceeding. It has everything to do with it, Your Honor, Claire shot back, taking a bold step toward the bench. Because the defense postulates that Mr. Sullivan was not randomly mugged. We believe Mr. Sullivan was engaged in an illicit cash transaction in his own unmonitored building, a transaction that went wrong. And when he had to explain the missing money to his investors, he fabricated a robbery and pointed the finger at the first convenient scapegoat the police provided, a young black man walking home from work. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The jury leaned forward, suddenly wide awake. Sullivan's face flushed a deep, furious red. That is an outrageous lie, he shouted from the stand. Pendleton slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack echoing violently. Order! Order in this court! Miss Montgomery, that is a wildly prejudicial and baseless accusation. You are out of line, counselor. It is not baseless, Your Honor, Claire said, her voice slicing through the noise. I have the corporate filings right here. They show a pattern of money laundering through the Sentinel building's commercial leases. And to prove Mr. Sullivan's absolute control over that building, I need to enter this document into evidence. She pulled the printed document from the folder. The trap was set. The bait was in the water. All Pendleton had to do was bite. I will not allow this circus to continue. Pendleton roared, his judicial composure fracturing. I am ruling right now that this document is inadmissible. It is entirely irrelevant to the charges against Mr. Caldwell. Your Honor, you cannot rule on the admissibility of a document you haven't even looked at, Claire challenged, her eyes locked dead onto the judge. I am formally requesting that Defense Exhibit F be marked for identification and entered into the record. To deny this without review is a blatant violation of my client's due process. Pendleton stared at her, his eyes burning with a venomous hatred. He was trapped by procedure. If he refused to even look at the paper, Claire would have an immediate, undeniable claim of judicial misconduct on the record. He had to look at it, dismiss it on technical grounds, and bury it. Fine, Pendleton hissed, spitting the word out like a curse. Approach the bench, counselor. Bring me your precious document. Claire walked purposefully toward the judge's bench. She handed one copy to Prosecutor Hayes, who looked at it with total bewilderment, and then she handed the primary copy up to Judge Pendleton. Pendleton snatched the paper from her hand. He shoved his reading glasses onto his nose, preparing to deliver a scathing dismissal. He read the first line. Apex Holdings, LLC, Principal Officers. His eyes tracked down to the highlighted section. There, printed in stark black ink against the white paper, were two names, Richard Sullivan, Alfred Pendleton. The silence that fell over the courtroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a devastating storm. Pendleton's face, usually flush with righteous anger, drained of all color, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The paper in his hand began to tremble, a microscopic vibration that quickly turned into a visible shake. He looked up, his eyes wide and terrified, locking onto Claire. She wasn't just looking back. She was staring him down with the righteous fury of 1,000 wronged defendants. What is this? Pendleton stammered, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. As you can see, Your Honor, Claire said, projecting her voice so the entire courtroom, especially the court reporter Brenda, could hear every single syllable. Defense Exhibit F is a certified corporate filing from the Cayman Islands Registry. It lists the principal officers and majority shareholders of Apex Holdings, LLC, the owner of the Sentinel Building. "Shut up," Pendleton whispered frantically, leaning over the bench. "Be quiet." But Claire was just getting started. She turned slightly, ensuring her voice carried directly to the jury box. The document clearly proves that the victim in this case, Mr. Richard Sullivan, is not just a tenant, but the co-owner of the building. But far more importantly, "I said quiet," Pendleton shouted, his voice cracking. He slammed his gavel wildly, multiple times, the wooden strikes chaotic and panicked. "This document is fabricated." "It is stricken from the record." "Bailiff, remove the jury from the room." "Clear the gallery!" The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Jurors gasped, standing up in confusion. Gallery members murmured loudly. Hayes, the prosecutor, was staring at his copy of the document, his jaw physically hanging open as he realized his judge and his victim were secretly in business together. "For the record," Claire shouted over the din, pointing directly at Pendleton, "the document lists the co-owner of Apex Holdings, LLC as the Honorable Judge, Alfred Pendleton, the presiding judge over this very trial." A collective gasp sucked the air out of Division 302B. Reporters in the back row scrambled for their phones, their thumbs flying across screens. "Bailiff, arrest her!" Pendleton screamed, spittle flying from his lips. He was standing now, his black robes looking less like a symbol of authority and more like a shroud. "Hold her in contempt! Call the police!" Bailiff Thomas stepped forward uncertainly, completely out of his depth. He looked from the screaming judge to the unyielding defense attorney, paralyzing indecision gripping him. "You have a direct, undisclosed financial relationship with the victim, Your Honor." Claire continued, her voice ringing like a bell, tolling the end of Pendleton's career. "You hold a massive financial stake in the property where the alleged crime occurred. You have systemically violated my client's civil rights, suppressed exculpatory evidence, and railroaded a young man to protect your own illegal offshore investments and your corrupt business partner." Sullivan leaped up from the witness stand, panic wiping away his smugness. "Alfred, do something! Shut her down!" he yelled, inadvertently confirming the entire accusation in front of a jury of 12, a court reporter, and an open gallery. David Caldwell slowly stood up from the defense table. He didn't yell. He didn't lose his temper. He simply buttoned the jacket of his cheap gray suit and looked up at the crumbling tyrant on the bench. "My uncle, Winston Caldwell, is a senior investigator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division," David said, his voice surprisingly steady, slicing through the shouting match. "He's been tracking Apex Holdings for 2 years. He couldn't get a warrant to breach the Cayman accounts until someone made a mistake on the record." Pendleton froze. The gavel slipped from his sweaty grip, clattering uselessly onto his desk. "You made the mistake, Judge," David said coldly. "You thought because of where I lived and what I looked like, I was just garbage you could sweep under the rug to protect your money. You thought I didn't matter, but you just gave the federal government everything they needed to subpoena your entire life." As if on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. 3 men and 2 women wearing severe, dark suits walked in. Their badges were clipped to their belts, flashing under the fluorescent lights. Leading them was a tall, broad-shouldered black man with a stern face and eyes that looked remarkably like David's Winston Caldwell. "Judge Alfred Pendleton," Winston's voice boomed, projecting an authority that made the judge look incredibly small. "I am Special Agent Winston Caldwell with the FBI. We need you to step down from the bench." "Now," Pendleton collapsed back into his leather chair. The arrogant sneer, the condescending drawl, the absolute power he had wielded like a weapon for 2 decades had all evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic old man staring at the ruins of his life. Prosecutor Hayes immediately dropped his files on his table and raised his hands, stepping away from the prosecution desk as if it were on fire. "Your Honor, given the circumstances, the state moves for an immediate dismissal of all charges against David Caldwell, with prejudice." Claire looked at David, A slow, exhausted, but triumphant smile spread across her face. David let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for weeks. The heavy chains of the false accusation, the terror of a rigged system, shattered entirely. He looked up at Pendleton, who was now being flanked by 2 federal agents, his wrists being secured behind his back. The gavel lay abandoned on the desk. The kingdom had fallen. And the young man Pendleton had tried to destroy was the one who had finally brought true justice into Division 302B. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles painted the stone columns of the state superior court in an eerie, frantic rhythm. Inside Division 302B, the silence had been replaced by the frantic clicking of camera shutters and the aggressive shouting of local reporters. Alfred Pendleton, the man who had ruled this room with an iron fist for 2 decades, was aggressively guided toward the heavy oak doors. His black judicial robe, the ultimate symbol of his unchecked authority, had been unceremoniously stripped from his shoulders by Special Agent Winston Caldwell, tagged, and placed into a plastic evidence bag. Underneath, Pendleton wore a wrinkled white dress shirt, his hands securely bound behind his back with heavy steel handcuffs. The metal bit into his wrists, a sharp, cold reminder that his kingdom was gone. As Pendleton was perp-walked down the center aisle, he passed the gallery. The faces staring back at him were a mix of shock, disgust, and profound vindication. He locked eyes with Claire Montgomery for a brief, fleeting second. She didn't gloat. She simply stood next to David Caldwell, her posture radiating an unbreakable resolve. She had done her job. The media frenzy outside was deafening. Pendleton shielded his face, stumbling as federal agents shoved him into the back of a black armored SUV. The door slammed shut, sealing him inside a dark, claustrophobic cage. The ride to the Metropolitan Detention Center was silent, the reality of his utter destruction settling over him like a suffocating blanket. 2 weeks later, the true, horrifying depths of Pendleton's corruption were laid bare in a massive federal indictment unsealed by the Department of Justice. The twist that the FBI had uncovered was far more sinister than simple money laundering. Pendleton wasn't just casually racist, he had monetized his prejudice. Winston Caldwell's forensic accounting team discovered a chilling pattern. Pendleton had deliberately targeted young minority men from specific blocks in the Eastern District. He consistently handed down maximum sentences, denying bail, and destroying families. But it wasn't just out of spite. By removing the primary earners from these households, Pendleton was intentionally triggering a wave of neighborhood defaults and foreclosures. Once the property values plummeted, Apex Holdings, LLC, the shell company he secretly co-owned with Richard Sullivan, swooped in to buy the distressed real estate for pennies on the dollar. They would then rezone and gentrify the blocks, flipping the properties to commercial developers for millions. Alfred Pendleton had weaponized the justice system to artificially manufacture a real estate crisis for his own personal wealth. He had literally traded human lives for high-rise condos. The hammer of karma fell swiftly and without mercy. Richard Sullivan, terrified of spending the rest of his life in a maximum security penitentiary, immediately flipped on his former partner. Sullivan handed over heavily encrypted hard drives containing thousands of emails. In them, Pendleton chillingly calculated potential prison terms based on property lines and target acquisition maps. Sullivan's testimony cemented a 70-count federal indictment against the disgraced judge, including racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy against civil rights, and witness tampering. Pendleton's arraignment was held in the United States District Court. He shuffled into the room wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit, his ankles chained together, the chains dragging across the floor with a hollow, metallic clinking sound. He stood before Federal Judge Sylvia Carver, a fiercely uncompromising jurist who possessed zero tolerance for judicial misconduct. "Mr. Pendleton," Judge Carver said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt, refusing to use his former title. "You have disgraced the bench, violated the sacred trust of the public, and systematically destroyed the lives of the very citizens you swore an oath to protect. Due to your vast offshore financial resources, I find you to be an extreme flight risk. Bail is categorically denied. You will remain in federal custody until your trial." Pendleton's knees buckled. A U.S. Marshal had to catch him by the arm to keep him from collapsing to the floor. He was sent to a windowless concrete cell. Stripped of his name, his wealth, and his dignity, he was no longer the Honorable Alfred Pendleton. He was inmate Heshite 4920-054. As for David Caldwell, the false charges against him were officially expunged from the record. With Claire Montgomery representing him, David filed a massive civil rights lawsuit against the municipality and the county for the systemic civil rights abuses perpetrated under Pendleton's watch. The city, desperate to avoid a catastrophic public trial, settled the case for $8.5 million. David didn't buy sports cars or luxury watches. He finished his mechanical engineering degree, graduating at the top of his class. With the settlement money, he purchased a large, abandoned warehouse in the Eastern District, the very neighborhood Pendleton had tried to destroy. David converted it into a state-of-the-art community center and STEM academy for underprivileged youth. He also heavily funded Claire Montgomery's new private practice, which specialized entirely in defending victims of judicial overreach and systemic bias. On the day the community center opened, David stood on the front steps, looking out at the neighborhood that was finally beginning to heal. He thought back to that dark, terrifying morning in Division 302B, when a corrupt man had tried to throw his life away. The system was broken, but it wasn't unbeatable. It just required someone brave enough to stand their ground and smart enough to let the arrogant destroy themselves. If this story of corrupt power meeting its match chilled you, don't let the conversation stop here. True justice requires a bright light shone in the darkest corners of the courtroom. Hit that like button, share this video with everyone you know, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, real-life legal dramas and shocking twists. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in David's shoes?